Once, long ago, so long now that to those who remember it would seem like a dream, there lived a boy named Gary. Gary didn't always do what his friend Sean told him to, but when they and their friend Taylor hung out, they usually ended up doing what Sean wanted. Sometimes, even when there were things that Gary didn't want to do. Most of the time, the things that Sean had them do, ditch out of school, spy on girls, shoplifting, bad, but a little fun. One night, though, when Sean and Taylor called him out of his room at 2 a.m., they did something that Gary knew he wanted no part in. Gary snuck out of his room, through his bedroom window, slunk down the street silently, staying to the shadows. Sean led them, with Taylor and Gary only steps behind, already sure of where they were headed. The three boys played in the Greenbelt, a rough network of undeveloped land, almost all the time. It was another thing that his parents had told him not to do that Sean had coaxed him into. He usually had fun in the strange wilderness, but he had never been there at night. Gary's heart beat loud in his ears as he bit against the frigid air. The street was deserted of traffic save for them and their shadows, which stretched and bent under the yellow halogen lights. Soon the street lights disappeared and the road they were on as well. They stopped for a moment when they reached the Greenbelt, looking at one another in silence, until Sean spoke in a hushed tone. "Follow me." He led them through the Greenbelt, and at first Gary was comforted when Sean took a trail that they all knew. Then he heard the screams. Sean and Taylor started running in the direction that the high-pitched howls had come from, and after hesitating for just a split second, Gary chased after them. The three of them stopped in one of the small clearings surrounded by dry, hungry brush that were numerous in the stretch of undeveloped desert. Sean and Taylor were already huddled around the thing, an animal Gary could now see, a cat. The cat howled and hissed at the three boys. Its angular chest heaved up and down spastically. It hung from its paws, which were splayed out against a wooden cross. Its fur was matted with blood. None of the boys spoke. Gary felt as if his whole chest had seized up, and he doubted if his mouth could form words, even if he knew what to say. The only sound was the cat's desperate howls as Sean slid the knife from his pocket. Gary could hear the soft click of him snapping it open. Sean didn't look back at the two other boys. Still quiet, he raised the knife, which Gary saw was trembling slightly, and drove it into the cat's tightly squinted eyes, one after the other. Sean scooted back a little, whether to give them a better view or avoid the blood, Gary couldn't tell, and stuck the knife into the cat's side, sliding it in between the ribs. The cat's screams, which had reached an unbearable peak, grew low and wet, and then stopped altogether. Gary's eyes bleared, but all three boys remained quiet. They didn't say anything else to each other the rest of the night. They only walked one by one out of the Greenbelt and down the streets until Gary broke off to hurry to his house. As he snuck back into his room, he wondered if they were talking now that he was gone, wondered what they might be saying. He started to think about the cat, about whether or not Taylor had known beforehand, and whether or not Sean might be crazy. Gary buried his face in his pillow, and he fell asleep that way. Gary stood at the podium, conductor's wand in hand. He couldn't quite see the room around him, but knew well enough that it was a booming theater. Before him a band of shapeless gray forms began to play a softly humming tune, and he realized the hand holding the wand had begun to sway back and forth. The wand in his hand started to swing faster and faster, the song growing and picking up tempo with it. As the music grew, the players grew in size until they were filling the auditorium, swelling against the walls. Gary frantically swung the conductor's wand, and just as the bulk moved in to crush him, he managed to pull his eyes open. Gary and Taylor didn't talk to each other at school the next morning, or even at lunch. Gary avoided Taylor, who seemed to be avoiding him for pretty much the whole day. He didn't see Sean at all. It was impossible to stop from thinking about the cat all day, and as Gary daydreamed in class, he couldn't steer his mind away from recalling the wet cries and look of crazed panic in the cat's huge eyes. He didn't care why Sean wasn't there in class. He secretly hoped that he would never come back. Gary walked home from school alone, hanging back until Taylor disappeared from sight before heading in the same direction. For the rest of the day, he felt tired. When he got home from school, he shrugged off his homework and watched TV until his parents came home and took control of the remote, turned on shows he couldn't stand enough to pay attention to. No matter how tired he felt, though, he sat awake in bed for what felt like an hour that night before finding comfortable darkness. Gary's eyes shot wide, his body already stiff with fear, though he didn't know why. Then it happened again, the slow, dragging screech of claws over glass. He shut his eyes and ignored the sound that, in all likeliness, his mind told him, was probably just a tree branch against the window, and fell back. The planet that they sent Gary to colonize was a vast round sea, speckled with only a few small islands. His base was tiny for an exploratory mission, and the sound of the endless global ocean always rang in his head. He stepped out of the sterile, self-contained shelter onto a dark graphite beach and looked out at the churning waters. He could sense some life out there, intelligent and angered by his intrusion. The swelling water grew into a massive wave, and just as some slick and terrible form burst free, Gary dug himself into the pillow and squinted his eyes open into the light just beginning to break through his bedroom window. The following day, Sean still wasn't at school, and this time, neither was Taylor. Nothing bad could happen. When Gary was sure about that, he would have heard about it. But the day went by as if they'd never even existed. Gary's mind drifted back to the cat, and he wondered if he didn't care. But then, he wondered what they might be doing. Wondered if they were in the Greenbelt right at that moment. Wondered if he should tell anyone. He walked home by himself. They had taken a quiz in class that day that Gary was pretty sure he had failed, and he had already forgotten about his homework. He just wanted to get on the couch and watch some TV. It wasn't until he was almost lost in his head, hypnotized from staring at the cracks in the sidewalk and listening to the rhythmic beat of his footsteps, that he heard the cat's howl. The cry was so ragged that, in truth, it sounded like it could have been anything, but Gary recognized it. The weight of his backpack seemed to suddenly gouge into his spine, and between its mass and his stiff shoulders, his back dampened with sweat. Determined to keep his cool, Gary pivoted around slowly and checked behind him. He saw, as he hoped and expected, nothing. His pace was a little faster the last few blocks to his house, the whole time half ready to hear the pain-stricken howl from every bush. When he got home, Gary took off his backpack, and gravity felt like it had suddenly turned down. The couch welcomed him, and the TV lulled him into what he considered a truly zen and meditative state. But later, after his parents had come home and forced him to do what homework they could, he had had dinner, he realized for some reason he was getting anxious. It was the sort of panic, jittery feeling that he thought people meant when they said they had butterflies in their stomachs, and it got worse in the oppressive darkness of his bedroom as he tried to force himself to sleep. Anxiousness aside, in moments his bed grew warm and familiar, and he faded away. Pain tore through Gary's hands. Each of his breaths were tight and sharp. Sean's face was huge and seemed to take up his entire field of vision. Gary cried out loudly, but Sean's face didn't seem to register the sound. He looked at Gary with a stony, almost solemn intent before his eyes flitted away to the hideously gleaming knife that just entered Gary's sight. Gary kept screaming those rough, animal sounds, but Sean's gaze stayed on the knife as he sunk it into Gary's eyes, which burst with a wet pop that echoed through his skull. Plunged into a world of darkness, he felt a cold, stinging pain in his side, and a sticky, choking feeling filled his chest. Gary gave one last wet, tearing cry, but couldn't wake up. This Horrible Creep is licensed under Creative Commons, Attribution Non-Commercial, No Derivative.